I've had this laptop sleeve for over 10 years and it's looking pretty bad. So today we're gonna make a quilted laptop sleeve, and I have been heavily inspired by the Baggu one. So we are going to recreate our own today, and I'm gonna use this leftover fabric from a lemon print set that I made this summer. I designed this fabric using the Adobe text to pattern feature, which is incredible. I really love it and I wanted to use it up. So this is the fabric that we're gonna use. I'm making one for my MacBook Pro today, but you can take measurements of your own device and use this method to make one any size you want. We're gonna start by measuring our device. You're gonna take the length, the width, and the depth measurements, and make sure to write that down somewhere. My laptop measured 8.5 inches by 12 inches, and the depth was 3/4 of an inch. So I wanted mine to look exactly like the Baggu one. One piece is gonna be just a rectangle, and the other piece is gonna be a rectangle, but with a flap extension that's gonna fold over and Velcro closed. To figure out how big to make these pieces, I added the length plus the depth, and then added a little bit of room and seam allowance. So that ended up being 12 inches plus 3/4 inches, which is the depth, plus another 1.5 inches. I did the same thing for the other side, so I added 8.5 inches plus the depth plus 1.5 inches. Then for the flap extension, I decided I wanted it to fold down about 1/3 of the way down the rectangle, so I added another 6 inches plus a 1/2 inch seam allowance. The extra 1.5 inches I added incorporates the seam allowance, and the extra inch on each side is just to give it a little bit of room and make it easier for the laptop to slide in and out of the sleeve. The measurements for mine ended up being 14.25 by 10.75. And for the second piece with the flap, I just will measure that same rectangle and then add another 6.5 inches and round off the corners. Here's a little diagram of my pieces and the formula that you can use to make your own pattern pieces. You're going to need to cut one main, one batting, and one lining of each piece. For this project, I'm using a low loft fusible fleece, but if you want yours to be a little fluffier looking, you could use a high loft one. Since the pattern pieces are really simple, I just marked them right onto my fabric. I marked the rectangle first and cut that out, and then for the piece with the flap, I marked the rectangle first, and then I added another 6.5 inches to the length, and I marked that from the midpoint of the end of the rectangle. Then lastly, I just freehanded a gentle curve from that point I marked out to the sides. And when I cut it, I just cut out one side and then I flipped it over in half and cut the other side so that the curve would be exactly mirrored. Next, you can use those same pattern pieces to cut out your fusible fleece and your lining pieces. Once you're done, you should have 6 pieces total. You should have one main, one batting, and one lining for each pattern piece. I've got all my pieces cut out. I'm using this leftover quilted fabric that I used to make a shacket a couple years ago, and I thought it would just add some nice extra padding on the inside. So I'm going to fuse my fleece to my main fabric first, and then we'll start sewing. If you're using fusible fleece like I am, you want to make sure the glue side is down, so that's the rough side of the fleece. And we're going to fuse that to both of our main pieces on the wrong side. I'm using a press cloth here just to make sure I don't get glue on my iron. If you're interested in getting one of these, I have this linked in my Amazon store, which is in the description. And whenever you're fusing, interfacing, or fleece to a fabric, you want to make sure you're just pressing down and not moving your iron around too much. I also like to use lots of steam just to get that glue to melt and fuse into the fabric. And you're just going to fuse both pieces of your fleece to both of your main fabric pieces. Once that's done, we're going to mark our quilting lines onto both main pattern pieces. I'm just going to do vertical lines like the Baggu bag, but you could really do anything you want. You could do diamonds, you could do horizontal lines, you could do squiggly lines, you can do anything you want. Quilting isn't something that I do that often. I've only done it a couple times to make some bags in the past, but making an actual quilt is something that I've always wanted to try. As a garment sewist, I know how to sew, but I really know nothing when it comes to quilting. But I'm going to change that thanks to today's sponsor, which is Skillshare. I just started a beginner quilting class by Esther Nariyoshi, and it's about how to sew your first quilt block. It goes over everything from choosing your fabrics, cutting out your pieces, building your block, and even covers common issues and fixes. I'm so excited to sew my first quilt. The class comes with a pattern download for a baby quilt, which is perfect because my sister just had a baby a few months ago and I would love to make my niece a quilt. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, and it has thousands of classes, from film to design to paper arts to sewing and textiles, freelance, and even productivity. I am a crafty girl through and through, always have been, always will be, and there is a whole section on crafts and DIY. There are classes on sewing, paper arts, jewelry making, ceramics, and upcycling and DIY. This honestly makes my heart so happy, and I could just hole up in my studio for the rest of the year and just take craft courses and I would be good. Another really cool thing that Skillshare has is learning paths, and they're a collection of curated classes designed to help you reach a specific goal. There's one on leveling up your editing in Premiere Pro, which I'm definitely gonna take. I taught myself how to use Premiere Pro by watching random YouTube tutorials and a lot of trial and error. And I wish I'd had something like this when I first started that would have walked me step by step through editing from the very beginning. Some other classes that I've been really interested in taking are the ones on productivity by Ali Abdal. I'm a busy mom with 2 young boys, and since taking the leap to do content creation full-time, I've been looking for ways to better manage my time and maximize my productivity. And I think these classes are gonna be so helpful for that. If you've been wanting to learn a new skill or maybe find a new hobby, now is the perfect time. Skillshare has so kindly given me a special link, and the first 500 people to use it are gonna get a 1-month free trial to Skillshare. You can find the link in my description box. Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to quilting those lines. Okay, so we were marking our lines, and I'm doing mine vertically, and I marked them at about 1.5 inches apart. Once you have all your lines marked out on both pieces, you can start quilting. If you have a walking foot, it would be a good idea to use it, and I'm using about a 3mm stitch length. I wanted it a little bit longer since it's kind of like top stitching. So you'll just keep sewing until you're done quilting all of the lines on both pieces. When you're done, your pieces should look a little bit like this, and then you're going to place them right sides together like this and pin along the sides and the bottom, and we're going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around, pivoting at the corners and making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. Then we're going to repeat the same thing with the lining pieces, except you're going to leave a 3 to 4 inch gap along the bottom edge of the lining. And this is so we can turn it right side out when we're done. Once those are both sewn, we're going to trim the corners just to reduce the bulk a bit. And then we're going to take our main piece and turn it right side out, making sure to poke the corners out. So we have our main piece, which is right side out, and our lining, which is inside out, and we're going to place the main piece inside of the lining so that right sides are facing each other. Then we're going to take it to the machine and sew the lining and the main together in one continuous seam that goes along the top of the flap and across the front of the sleeve. And again, I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. This part can be a little bit tricky, so I use the free arm of my machine, and I just took my time maneuvering the fabric so I could get all the way around in one go. Now we're just going to trim the excess seam allowance along the top edge and the front. You want to make sure you trim it down pretty close to the stitch line because this part can get pretty bulky and we need to top stitch this later. Now it's time to turn the bag right side out, so you're going to grab the main part through that hole that we left in the lining and just pull it through gently until it's all right side out. Make sure to poke out the corners and push out all the seams so everything lays nice and flat. Now we're going to sew that gap that we left in the lining closed. You can either top stitch this or hand stitch it if you want it to be invisible. To top stitch, you'll just fold that seam allowance in and edge stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. This is what your sleeve will be looking like, and you're just going to take that lining piece and push it into the main. And the last thing we're going to do is top stitch around that top edge. For the top stitching, I'm using a 3mm stitch length because I want it to be a little bit longer. And before I started sewing, I just rolled the lining down a little bit and clipped it in place so that it wouldn't slip out while I was sewing. And I'm sewing about 1/4 inch away from the edge. And we're just going to sew all the way around the top edge of the flap and around to the front, and make sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. And finally, we're just going to add Velcro so we can close it. I'm using this 1-inch Velcro that I had in my stash. It has an adhesive on the backing so that you can easily stick it in place before you sew it. I actually ran into some problems with the glue on the back of this because it was so sticky and it started to jam up my machine, and my needle was getting stuck and the thread was getting stuck to the needle. So if you have similar Velcro, it might be a good idea to hand stitch this. Anyways, you're just going to want to place your Velcro where you want it and then either stick it or pin it in place, and then we'll top stitch around the edges of the box, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and the end. As I said, I ended up hand sewing mine. This is what the glue did to my needle and my thread. You can see it's super sticky and the thread was just like sticking to the needle and it was not good. So 0 to 10, do not recommend. I got it on eventually, and this is how it turned out. I love it so much. It's so cute and it looks almost exactly like the Baggu one. I love this fabric and I'm so glad I got to use it up to make this. And it is just the perfect laptop sleeve. I think it has just the right amount of padding and also just the right amount of space for my laptop to slide in and out, but also be secure at the same time. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you found it helpful, and if you did, I would love it if you gave it a like and subscribed. If you make your own, I would love to see it, so make sure to tag me on Instagram and TikTok at SewBakeMake. I recently reached some milestones here on YouTube and also Instagram and TikTok. We're now at 40,000 subscribers here and over 500,000 on Instagram and 100,000 on TikTok, which is super exciting. So I thought I might do a little Q&A video. If you have any questions about sewing or content creation or sewing pattern design, let me know in the comments and I will work on putting that together. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.